Adam Fennessy PSM is the Secretary of the Australian Government Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, DAF. Adam has over 25 years of public sector experience at state and federal levels. His former roles have included Secretary of the Victorian Department of Environment and Primary Industries, Secretary of the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and yes, there's a few more, so you can see why I'm reading this off the sheet. The Victorian Public Sector Commissioner and Dean and CEO of the Australian and New Zealand School of Government. Adam has worked in the private sector as a partner with global advisory firm Ernst & Young. I'll leave it with you.
A particular thank you, Kate, for kicking us off this morning and for introducing me just now. I am going to chair this next session, which will be both a one-on-one discussion with Brenton, who I'll introduce shortly, and then a really interesting panel discussion. So I'll start by acknowledging we're on Ngunnawal country and paying my respects to the traditional owners of where we're gathering. I want to give a big shout out firstly to the ABARES team. We've already seen Dr. Jared Greenville this morning and our amazing sector analysts. It's a huge effort, and pretty much when we finished last year's ABARES Outlook, which was over at the Hyatt, we were planning for this year's. I remember working in agriculture in the state of Victoria years ago, coming to the ABARE Outlook Conference. Now it's the ABARES Outlook Conference with an S. And this year it's the 80th anniversary of ABARES and its predecessors, and I think it's the 50th anniversary of the equivalent of the Outlook Conference. So it's my privilege to be here today, and it's also really important to me to, sometimes it's the behind the scenes work on statistics, data, economic analysis, productivity that can really help our agriculture industry thrive. So that is a nice way to introduce Brenton Goldsworthy, the Deputy Australian Statistician, because in fact I was saying to Brenton just before that you measure what matters. How you measure and what matters is a critical part of what we do in our daily lives. The Australian Bureau of Statistics is a very strong institution within Australia, and last year I remember being very excited when ABARES updated me on the agricultural modernisation statistics process that we're working on with the ABS. So that's what Brenton and I will talk about. Brenton, just to give a bit of introduction to you, you're the Deputy Australian Statistician. You lead the Insights and Statistics Group. That group is responsible, and you're responsible for producing the ABS's demographic, economic and social statistics, including the census. We all know about the census and we all know how important that is. You have also worked in the Treasury, and I love this about your career. You've represented Australia at the embassy in Tokyo, you've worked in the Prime Minister's Department, and you also worked with the International Monetary Fund. So to me, that's an excellent combination of national economic policy, international, or understanding how international markets and economies work, as well as understanding the importance for the Australian agricultural context. We are all about exports. So you've been there representing Australia in Japan, which is, I think, our fourth or third biggest market. Someone will probably correct me as to the size of the Japanese export market for agriculture, fisheries, forestry. So, Brenton, thank you so much for being here today as part of our discussion. And before I throw to you with my first question, I'll just let everyone know that Brenton and I are going to go through in detail with a conversation about agricultural statistics, which certainly get my pulse running, and they will after this session if they haven't already for you. And then after about 20-25 minutes, we're going to be joined by three panellists who are from across the agriculture industry. I won't introduce them now in detail, but I will say that Katie McRobert, Sam Brown and Jojo Solai will join us for a broader interactive panel discussion. We've been getting great online questions from many of you, including to those who are online joining us from around Australia. We'll also throw a few questions to the floor and get a few people, a few voices with a few roving mics. So that's how the session will go. Now, I talked about how excited I was when I came to the department 2 years ago and found out that we were part of this agriculture statistics modernisation process. And I think you'll understand why, particularly when you hear about mysterious cows that have appeared, why the data, the collection and the measurement really does matter. So, Brenton, for my opening question, the ABS has undertaken a major change in the way you produce agricultural statistics. The ag census approach that you used to undertake historically was ceased, and the major agricultural commodity survey was part of that. You've now moved to a mix of new data sources to produce agricultural statistics. The first set was released last year. And the anecdote about those cows is there's a lot of attention came through when your first new publication went out there that the new estimate of cattle numbers increased by 4 million. One reporter at the time said, well, did the ABS go and, were you hiding 4 million cows or did you find them somewhere? So, Brenton, can you tell us a bit about the new methodology and also tell us a bit about those 4 million cows?
Happy to. And thank you for the introduction and great to be here today. So I joined the ABS about 2 years ago, similar timeframes, and at the time fully expected when driving to work I'd be hearing about a whole bunch of ABS stats, GDP, inflation, unemployment rate, but I did get quite a shock when driving to work one morning. I heard a story about 4 million missing cows, and while that comment was said in jest, it was a comment that colleagues and myself took very seriously at the ABS. I think in your introduction you used a formulation like ABS is one of our strongest institutions, and we're a strong institution because people can rely on us producing objective, reliable statistics that are available openly and widely for all. So any sense that our statistics weren't reliable really grabbed our attention. Now, as to 4 million and how they came about, as you said, it really was about a change in methodology, which I know for users, I've been on the other end, you hate hearing a change in methodology is causing a big change in numbers, but that was reality, but I think it does put us in great stead going forward. So, as you said, we used to do surveys, so the previous estimates of cattle numbers were based on survey estimates, in large part to minimise the reporting burden on smaller farms. The survey would only go out to farms above a certain size threshold. The new approach uses a lot more of admin data and actually has quite strong parallels with the way we estimate population figures of people in Australia. So essentially what we do is we take the closing stock of the period before, we add inflows, we take away outflows, we take account of movements, and through that process we keep up-to-date figures of how many, in this example, cattle there are in Australia. And we particularly use admin data to estimate the inflows. So based on previous survey data and relationships, there's a strong relationship between rainfall and fertility. So we use data on rainfall in the current year to estimate the number of new calves. So yes, admin data plays an important role. When you change approach, there's always benefits and costs, and I think we might go into some of that later on. But clearly we've got more complete coverage. So through the admin data, we pick up all farms, not just those farms that were above a certain threshold that received the survey. There's also coherence across different data sources. So we now, given that model that I sort of briefly outlined, the data we have for the inflows and outflows and movements, that they all add up to the number of cattle, whereas previously there wasn't that coherence. And reducing reporting burden on farmers as well. So there's some positives, but also some big risks, like we talked a little bit about, I guess, reputation to the ABS and changing a number so drastically. So very conscious that for a lot of users, they care more about year-to-year movements than the actual level. So for that reason, we produced 5 years of historical data when we introduced the new methodology. And we also just worked in really close partnership with industry throughout. So We were aware of some concern, I guess, about the former numbers, so we worked with industry to make sure we built that trust and have their support in the new methodology. So yeah, so I think we've made great progress, but still more work to do.
Yeah, and a couple of reflections there, Brenton, and thank you for that really thoughtful first answer, that there are a whole lot of different factors like reporting burden, as well as, many farmers who are just want to farm and they're very busy and they might not want to fill out a survey. So the costs and benefits, some of the benefits might be taking that burden off farmers and agribusinesses. Some of the risks might be people say, well, I've been doing it like this for decades and I'm third generation and we always did it like that. So it's not easy to change things. And there may be risks as well, like the media says there's 4 million new cows that have appeared from somewhere. The other thing I know is that you mentioned the word trust, having a reliable source of information that we can make decisions on, both in government, but also individual businesses and farmers can make decisions knowing they've got a good source of information. I think that is critical. So I think there's a lot to reflect on in terms of the modernisation approach that the ABS has taken. Now I know that you're the provider of the data and we're a user, and while I'm asking you questions, you might even have a question for me.
So I do, and so we work very hard. Staff at the ABS work very hard to produce statistics, right? And a key purpose, I guess, is to provide information to inform evidence-based decision making. So it's always great to get feedback from users of data as to how it's actually used to inform policy design or policy implementation. So yeah, so I guess the question is, do you have any experiences with that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I do. And so one of my reflections is there's a real kind of three-way approach here. How do we give you feedback as a user, but also how do we work with many in this room in terms of the agricultural community or industry? How do we collectively know what you want or they want? How do we then use it? How do you collect it? It's almost like a wholesale retail model. And I should say, if I'm talking about a three-way relationship, there's also the partnerships we have with universities, institutions and others, because we don't do all the policy on our own. But to go to your question, we use it primarily in agriculture policy development and in program design. To give you some examples, there's been a lot of talk today and a lot of data already about the impacts on productivity growth and climate. So we heard this morning that dry seasonal conditions in SA and Victoria have had impacts on the cattle herd, or a bumper crop and a late breaking winter season in WA has helped a positive benefit on climate. So understanding longer term impacts of climate and indeed natural disasters on agriculture and communities is one critical example. Another really important one is we provide biosecurity services, and we are the biosecurity regulator for Australia. Understanding things like the distribution of livestock, those same cattle, is important so we can take a risk-based approach to how we might invest in biosecurity protection in, say, Northern Australia, where a lot of certain parts of the herd are, or what might that look like for more concentrated livestock in other parts of the country. So it's not just the number, but the distribution of livestock. Those data sets are really important for us to then design our biosecurity interventions. The third example because I'll mention ABARES does a lot of work with other parts of Australian government. We do a lot of work with the Murray-Darling Basin Authority on water, and I've seen some really interesting data that ABARES published last year on the overlay of lower water use and lower socio-economic conditions. So if you've got water leaving parts of Australia that overlays with socio-economic data, also from the ABS, we know that will have a much bigger impact on those communities. And that then helps us not just with our agricultural productivity, but working with communities that are really impacted by water markets or the movement of water, just as we would use similar data on impacts on, say, farmers from drought. So many examples, but that's why we were so excited with the modernisation process, because that investment, whether it be 4 million more cows we knew the distribution of, or the crossover with other data from ABS, say social data, helps us design our interventions as well for programs that might support agricultural communities and industries that are going through transition. Yeah.
So it's great to hear those examples, and it's great to share it in a forum like this, because while we're moving towards admin data, we still run a whole bunch of surveys, so we do ask a lot of people in terms of providing their information to us. So I think one of the things we often talk about, particularly in the census context, but more broadly, is how we give back. So we ask a lot of people when providing us information, so great to share those examples of how that information has actually benefited the industry and the economy more broadly.
Yeah, and I think on that point, it also tells a story that whether it's the census data or specific industry data like of agricultural industry, it does take some time and effort for individuals, and people will want to know, well, what use are you going to put that to? And some of the answers in ag is, better targeted adjustment programs for drought, or better access to international markets based on demand profiles or commodity behaviours, and all the data that we heard earlier today. So it really makes a difference, which is why true data nerds get really excited with the processes that you run through as you work through different sectors. Now, I'll go to my next question. We've talked about, I've already mentioned partnerships, and we're effectively talking about how we work together, ABS, ABARES and DAF. Industry experts are really important as well. So, Brenton, can you talk about partnerships with industry experts in terms of how you've developed these new methods? Can you tell us a bit about the sort of input that you get from industry in the agricultural context?
Yeah, so partnerships have certainly been critical, and a big shout out to ABARES for helping to set up and support and run these expert working groups that we have with industry. So at the ABS, we have professional statisticians who are world leading in areas like survey design, methodology, integrating different data sets and so on. That's only part of the story, right? So we look to engage closely with industry to better understand, I guess, what statistics are needed, and also to understand the data sets that they have available and we might be able to access through administrative sources. And that's been particularly important as we've shifted our approach from surveys to using more of these admin data. So a lot of the conversations with industry have been about, I guess, the strengths and weaknesses of different data sets, particular quirks specific to that industry. And often actually helping us negotiate access to the data sets as well, which has been incredibly valuable. So I'll give you one example about the levy payer register. So that data has both value and volume. It's collected on value, so we're very confident that that number is correct. But often when the volume is entered, some people mistakenly put kilograms rather than, say, tonnes. So that produces an implausible price per tonne calculation. So through our collaboration with industry, we've been able to understand, this particular quirk and set up automated edits to correct for, honest mistakes in entering data, which, without that collaboration with industry, this would have been a lot more problematic.
Yeah. If I could just jump in there, because a lot of people in the room will know about agricultural levies. Some may be less familiar, but a lot of the funding we do for research development across different commodities are collected through levies. So that's, as you say, the combination of very specific targeted data as well as the volumes of that data.
Yeah. So I think we've had over 50 meetings as part of these expert working groups, and so I guess in summary, we work well with industry. We take on board their views and suggestions on the type of stats they would find most useful, and understanding the data that's available is incredibly useful.
Yeah. To stay down this practical trajectory and to open or sort of pull back the curtain on what it's like in the ABS, we know in any industry you get loud voices, you get quiet voices, you get everything in between. So I'm sure you get a lot of differing opinions across those industry groups and even across different parts of government where we might say, you know, we're more important or we're special. How do you avoid the loudest voice influencing the statistics so it's always as evidence-driven as possible?
Yeah, so this comes up in so many different contexts, right? So I'll make a couple of points which I think apply more broadly. One is we welcome different perspectives. So the reason why we engage outside of the ABS with industry, ABARES and others is to get those different perspectives. So we really do encourage people to speak openly and share their honest and frank views with us. The second point is when there is that tension, I think understanding and being really clear about roles and responsibilities is important here. So I kind of touched on this in my previous answer. We look to industry to provide us with advice on the particular statistics that they find most valuable, and to give you one example of how that's influenced our decision making. You know, we started off by talking about the number of cows. We applied our new methodology to cattle rather than sheep, in large part because of industry feedback that due to emissions, they would find that more valuable. So that's just a little example of how industry engagement has informed our decisions about what we produce. And the other aspect, again, I touched on a little bit in the previous answer, is around helping us to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the different data sets. Now, that's often where some of the different voices can come through in the discussion. We try and focus the discussions on helping us to understand the features of the different data sets, and then it's kind of falls to us. Like, the bread and butter of the ABS is making these statistical judgments about how we can best combine all the different administrative data sources and survey data to produce the stats that are of use to users. And we have an internal statistical methods board that signs off on all these changes we make, and we see that as being incredibly important to ensure there's rigour and objectivity behind the statistics we produce and any changes that we make. So yeah, so for me it's about drawing out those perspectives, but then being really clear about the roles and responsibilities of all.
Mm-hmm. Brenton, I think that's a great example. And you mentioned getting industry feedback and moving from sheep to cattle, to put it as a simple summary. Earlier today, Jared Greenville was showing that some of the earliest definitions of, I think, farms within Australia was if you had more than 200 sheep. Now, that might have made sense 100 years ago. I hope I quoted that or referenced that one correctly, Kurt, or someone else. But whatever that looks like, things have changed enormously in Australian agriculture. So things change and evolve. And I do love, I've got to say, that kind of customer-led approach to ask the user of, or user-led approach to how you design long-term changes in collection of statistics. We learn a lot as well, and that to me is why that industry engagement and listening to voices, loud, quiet, squeaky, otherwise.
And drawing out the quiet ones as well.
Yeah, and that's right, and not just listening to the loud voices. I know in agriculture with a lot of very passionate farmers, I was talking to someone who's got a farm down in the Colac-Otway region, which is very wet, and I think he had 80 years of family collected data from the rain gauge out the back. So you'll get data sets from lots of angles, and you'll get lots of opinions, and you'll get state entities that might collect data, industry groups. My next question is, when does data move from being interesting to official? So can you tell me about what official statistics are, and tell me a bit about the UN Statistical Division?
Yeah, well, you kind of answered the question in a sense. So official statistics is actually defined by the United Nations Statistical Division as, so it refers to stats published by government agencies, essentially, such as the ABS. There's interesting context to this in terms of the UN promotes the importance of official statistics in democratic societies. So you can imagine in a number of countries just having official stats available to inform all, and by all we sort of mean not just government but opposition, press, public, business, just the situation in the country, be it the economy, social, environment. The UN also goes out to set out a bunch of quality dimensions that sort of need to be met or should be met in order for it to be considered an official stat, so not just produced by a government agency, but also quality thresholds. And some examples here are attributes like objectivity, reliability, and openly accessible. And I think we touched on this earlier, but we take that very seriously at the ABS. So if you look at our website and you look at what the purpose of the ABS is, we have a very clear statement about we are the official source of independent, reliable information. So that's why, that reliability is so important to us. I think it's important to say, though, particularly in a room like this, that doesn't mean it's only the official stats that matter. So the ABS has a funding constraint. We don't have unlimited resources, so we're always having to prioritise what statistics we produce. And in part because of that, inevitably there's going to be data gaps, right, that others can fill, whether it's more granular information, whether it's information that is of specific value to a small segment of society rather than more generally. So I think there's a lot of value from data produced by other bodies complementing the official stats. What I would say, though, is that where things get a little bit tricky is where there's overlap. So we've seen some examples in the social statistics space, for example, where we put out some data on, the one that I particularly have in mind is around family and domestic violence. Another organisation also puts out data, very, very different results. Now, the ABS and the other provider can reconcile the differences by pointing to things like changing different definitions or scopes or sampling methodology. But from the user's perspective, it's just outright confusing. And we had a similar situation with some horticultural stats and really also the cattle numbers where we started the conversation. So yeah, official stats are important. There's a role for other stats, but where there's overlap, potential for confusion. And I think it's important for the ABS to play a leading stewardship role in trying to reconcile those differences.
And Brenton, I think the double level of importance there, and you've mentioned trust and also the importance all the way through to democratic institutions, that you've got that authoritative source of data. I said to you before that we use your data to design our policies and programs, and we use taxpayers' money, we use levy payers' money, we use everyone else's money. So we need that trust and authority as well. If we are investing 100 million here or 1 million there rather than somewhere else, how do we maintain the confidence of both taxpayers generally and the agricultural industry in particular? So I think trust, transparency, and also the practical utility of these things. So, levy payers, farmers, taxpayers know you're going to get something out of your hard-earned money. And I know we've got a number of farmers and agribusinesses in the room. Everything's got to be value to help you increase your productivity or profitability, increase food security, whatever the outcomes are of our government. I'm going to move to the last question now for this part of the discussion, and then I'm going to call up our co-panellists. My last question is a bit of a forward look. Technology is a really important part of what we do. It also helps a lot with productivity. You've talked about different data sources and administrative or a diverse range of data. There's more traditional things like levy payer data registers and farm surveys. There's emerging data, which has been around now for maybe 10, 15 years, satellite crop mapping. There are sensors on equipment. There is the Internet of Things. I've even worked in other parts of government where you mine social media for data to get a sense of trends and analysis. You can get data from lots of different directions. And I haven't even mentioned artificial intelligence yet. Can you give us some reflections on emerging trends you're seeing from the ABS, specific to ag if possible, like data sensors and satellite crop mapping, or other sources that you see as an opportunity to continue to refine how you collect and produce your data?
Yeah, so the environment has just changed enormously, right? So a real step change in the amount of data that's available. Certainly agriculture, but we see it across the board. One of our early uses at the ABS in using what we call big data is scanner data from supermarkets and big retail chains to produce the consumer price index. And increasingly we're moving away from doing surveys of business to construct retail trade surveys, and we're using bank transactions data to produce monthly indicators of household spending. So enormous quantities of data. Partly the way I think about it is some of it is new data that wasn't previously available that we can now get access to, and some of that relates to, I think, a culture where there's a growing recognition of the value of data, a little bit where we started really early on talking about the value proposition of providing data to organisations like us to improve decision making, more trust in us protecting the data, which is critical. That's something we take enormously seriously at the ABS. But the other one is just technology, which I think is where your question is going. And so satellite data is one where we've been using increasingly, and I think there's a lot more opportunities to apply it to other areas. But one example of we're using satellite data is just to better understand actually where crops are being produced. So we released broadacre stats, I think the week before last, and we're able to come up with really good quality statistics that Esperance region in WA is the biggest producer of wheat and canola, and Burdekin for sugarcane in Queensland, and also more accurate data in the sense that a lot of the large complex farms have their headquarters in regional cities. So we'd often find a city would be the biggest producer of wheat, which we kind of intuitively knew wasn't the case, but we could use satellite data to actually allocate that production to where it was actually being produced. The other one is farm software data, which I've just been hearing quite a bit about the last week or two. So large complex farms often collect a whole bunch of data. These companies aggregate that data across farms. So a real opportunity, I think, for us to tap into that. We're already sort of dipping our toe in the water, so to speak, in terms of getting aggregate data. But again, through, I think, building a trusted relationship, there's potential to get more granular data. And again, there's parallels elsewhere in the ABS. For a little while now, we've been working with accounting software companies for our small business surveys, and rather than sending out a survey for people to fill in by hand, working with the software companies, we can automatically extract information on business turnover, sales, profitability, all those key indicators. So reporting burden has gone from about half an hour to about 5 minutes. So yeah, a lot of opportunity, but the other thing we've found is that it's also quite costly, because the data, which is largely collected for another purpose, isn't always provided to us in a neat form that enables us to readily spit out into an official stat. So it's a different set of challenges we face in turning it into official stats. But yeah, huge opportunity.
Yeah, well, Brenton, that's a really good point at which to now move to our panel, because we're going to ask for other perspectives on data for shaping modern agriculture. Before I introduce our other panellists, can I just thank you for sharing your insights as Deputy Australian Statistician on behalf of the ABS. We know the value of the relationship between DAF and ABARES and ABS is critical, and we're doing our job if we're helping farmers and agriculture, fisheries, forestry across Australia. So thank you for the first part.
Yep.
Please stay on the panel, and we'll broaden out that conversation now about data for shaping modern agriculture. So I'm just going to give you a quick thank you, Brenton, if I could ask you to join me. And so now, to broaden out the conversation, I'm going to invite Katie McRobert, Sam Brown and Jojo Soilai Hlaing, who I'll introduce as they come to the stage. And we're going to broaden this perspective and ask about data in different contexts across agriculture, opportunities, gaps, what's working well, what we could do better. So as our panellists join me, I will introduce each one. So Katie McRobert will be very well known to many in the room. You are the Executive Director of the Australian Farm Institute. You have worked there since 2017, and you took on the Executive Director role in 2024. You've also worked for Rabobank and as the National Editor for Farm Online. So once again, a great sweep or set of perspectives. And I know at the annual AFI Roundtable, that's another must-go-to event.
Thank you.
We talk about a lot of similar things.
Yeah.
So, Katie, thank you for joining us today. I will next introduce Jojo Sorlai from the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation. Jojo, it's great to have one of our RDCs here. And at Sundowner, a plug for 5 p.m, that is an event later today that's sponsored by the RDCs. You are doing work both for the FRDC but also with other RDCs, an excellent collaborative project, the Australian Agriculture Data Exchange, to help liberate data and bring it closer to delivering value, picking up on the discussion that Brenton and I just had. So, Jojo, welcome to the panel.
Thank you.
And Sam Brown, who has also had a very rich range of experiences across agriculture. You worked in what was the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries, Forestry. I'm not sure what it was called back then.
It's DAF.
It was DAF. So you worked in DAF 1.0. And you then went on to lead the CEO of LifeCorp, another one of our RDCs, for just under 10 years. Very much delivering that R&D that relies on the data that we all use. And then you were the inaugural CEO of Agriculture Innovation Australia, which the role you took on in 2021, and in particular looking across systems, not just agriculture, but indeed broader systems of value that agriculture creates for our societies. So, Sam, thank you for joining the panel. I think certainly it's my privilege to have to be able to ask questions to so many different experts. So what I'll do is I'll start by asking each of you a question around the key work you're doing on shaping modern agriculture, and then I'll grab some tech and we'll throw it open to questions both coming through on the feed. And I'm going to ask a few in the room, old style tech of getting you to throw questions from the floor as well. So, Katie, if I could start from you. I remember at an AFI roundtable, I think it was 2 years ago, we saw the launch of the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework. And Fiona Simpson, who I saw here earlier today, although I'm not sure if she's still here this afternoon, that was a long-term joint project between the NFF, DAF was involved, and the Australian Farm Institute was very involved as well. So can you tell me a bit about the work that you've done in that context, opportunities, gaps and other needs?
Yeah, thanks. It's a big question, how do we use data in agriculture? And I think you've set that out very nicely, Brendan and Adam there. One of the things we've learned about participating in the AASF project, and I'm going to use the acronym AASF, but that's Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework, now I don't have to say it all over again, is that when we started to build that, a lot of people were saying, well, here's the information we already have, we'll give it to you and you can use that information. So here's what we know about agriculture, tell everybody how sustainable we are. And it became pretty apparent quite quickly, especially when we started having global conversations, that that's not what people needed to hear, because the information that's important to you might not be important to someone else. So you've got to figure out what the use of the information is and what it communicates to other people. Data is absolutely vital to understanding not only agriculture but every sector of the economy, but unless you've decided on what the purpose of that data is, it won't have meaning to the people you're trying to communicate with. So the AASF was designed then around a principles, criteria, indicators structure, which meant the principles were at the top and the indicators and the metrics and measures and all the other data-rich sources are down the bottom for a reason, because that outlines what those shared values are that connect people across different sectors of the economy, different parts of production systems, different countries, different backgrounds, different expectations. So anyone can look at a framework like that and say, biodiversity matters to me because I care about birds, I care about my farm, I care about my soil. It matters to me as a consumer because I also care about birds, and so we've got something in common that we can share. Now you can tell me about the biodiversity metrics that you have, and they'll make sense to me. So that's something we learnt from the AASF. But the lesson behind all of this work, and it's an ongoing lesson that we learn new every week really, is that the data needs to build trust. You've got to decide what the purpose of the data is. And if you think about a use case being our trade system, it's not the only thing we do in ag, even though we do export 70% of the value of what we produce, so we're trade dependent. But trade is really dependent on trust. If you try and build yourself a mental map of all the trade relationships that Australia has with China, the US, the UK, the EU, Southeast Asia, and then how those relationships spread out as a web across the world and all the different kind of connection points there are there, none of that functions without trust, as we can see pretty clearly, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot more of in the next session as well. And the trust won't be there unless you can prove what you're saying is true. So trust is really necessary to support those claims. So I don't want to take up all the time, but that's sort of my perspective to start off with, and I'll hand back to you, Adam.
Right. Thanks, Katie. That's a great opening reflection, particularly going back to that theme of trust, which Brenton and I have been talking about already, in particular to prove the value of what you do and to apply to use cases. Jojo, I'll move to you next. I'm very keen to hear more about the Australian Agricultural Data Exchange and how you and FRDC, Fisheries Research Development Corporation, is coordinating RDC efforts. And to me, as part of that, many in the room will know and others may not, that we have 15 RDCs. Yep. How do you coordinate that effort, particularly when there's such a rich amount of research, development and extension happening in that context?
Well, how I do that is actually lift up the challenges quite a bit so that we have commonalities. We've heard a lot today about the challenges that we're facing right now, right? It's like we've got climate change challenges, we've got weather events, workforce and all that stuff. But at the same time, we still need to be producing food in a sustainable manner, right? People aren't going to go away. We've got there's going to be 40% more population by 2100, means we need to produce like 70% more food, and we need to do that with less. We need to do more with less. And to do that, we can't just get there by taking the traditional incremental approach anymore. If we rewind back the clock a few decades, we've met these kinds of existential crises before. The population time one was predicted, where we won't be able to feed people anymore because we run out of space to actually grow more food. But that was averted when we had innovation like the Green Revolution, where we can decouple production of food from the use of land, right? We need something like that right now because we've got all these existential crises and challenges coming to us. And to do that, it's innovation. And to me, data is the fuel of innovation. What we're producing here is the raw material for food. Data is the raw material for innovation that's going to get us out of here. We can't eat less to get out of here because we're still going to have the same amount of, or if not more amount of challenges coming up. And to do that, we need to liberate the data. And when I mean liberating the data, it's not just about liberating just public data sets, right? We need to actually liberate the private data sets that's held by all of the producers. Brenda, you mentioned like the farm data systems. We've got data that's being collected in all different places. They need to use it for sustainability reporting. They need to use it for compliance reporting. They need to use it for their own internal business decision. How do we liberate that to bring insights, which is the value that you get from data? And you can't get that by just having one data set. You need to have multiples and multiples of data set. And how do you help liberate it? How do you engender the trust for the people that are liberating their private data sets so that it's not misused? And being able to do that, my view, would help us accelerate the innovation agenda a lot more.
Again, that's a great opening reflection. That firstly, we've talked about productivity this morning, including with the Productivity Commission. Doing more with less is a very good, straightforward definition of productivity. You've also touched on another issue that came up at the start of the day about food security and the fact that data is the fuel or raw material of innovation. I remember it was about 15 years ago, people were saying data's the new oil. But how do we avoid just drilling a lot of holes to kind of, mess the analogy and have oil spurting out? How do we use that in a meaningful way for things like food security or value or, regional development or whatever it might be?
So we've mentioned there's a reticence by people to actually collect more data or fill out more surveys, right? So we need to meet the FAIR principles so that we can collect once, use multiple times. Like the data is there, collect once, and then have that feedback loop go back in with regards to how the data is used, so that people like Brenton can say, if you collect your data in a different way, this could add value back. And that in itself will help, I guess, data producers not have the burden of having to collect multiple times to fill out just slightly different forms of data for different purposes, and they do that again and again, which stifles a lot of the data liberation. So it's the collect once, use multiple times, and if possible, have it standardized so that it could be used for a lot more different purposes.
Yeah, thanks, Jojo. Sam, I'll move to you next. I've already mentioned we have 15 RDCs, and you ran one of those RDCs for many years at Agriculture Innovation Australia. One of the challenges is how to work across the system of agriculture, not just RDCs, but the much broader spread of things. So could you reflect on that challenge of working collectively rather than as individual industries across agriculture? What are some of your reflections from your career and from what you've heard as well today?
Yeah, thank you. And look, it's difficult not to resist the temptation to jump into some of what Jojo's showing, because I mean, we certainly agree and see a lot of that, but let's just reflect on that. I mean, there's many layers and dimensions to what you've just asked me about, working across industries, and it really speaks to the establishment of AIA. We have a mandate to work across the 15 research and development corporations to address issues, the big cross-sectoral issues. And these are the sorts of things that shouldn't be addressed singly in a commodity sense, because they're going to have major impacts. Now, when we were formed, there were 8 priority areas that the research RDCs, collectively provide us, and they were things across climate, biosecurity, natural capital, energy, waste, circular economy. There's quite a field of them, but one of them was digital and data. And see, we did a lot of work internally about digital and data to look at what had already been done across RDCs, but we were also able to, swiftly move through a whole bunch of things that had already been spent. And that was some of the work in precision to decision, and we could see some of that work sitting in the background that could be utilised internally. Now, what we first worked on was climate, and that was an impact that was going to be happening across all commodities. It didn't necessarily matter if you're in the wine industry or wool or whatever. It needed to be addressed collectively, and that's really the importance of spending that dollar once rather than multiple times to address that duplication. So what we did in our climate initiative, we started working on a project which was then called Know and Show Your Carbon Footprint. And the concept from the RDCs was saying, look, we've all got to assist our individual sectors with GHG accounting at some point, but why not work together? So that was the principles which we started that particular project. I mean, we sort of jumped into that and applied a lot of the collaborative type principles that we were furnishing ourselves with. Notably, we spent a lot of time, we did 140 interviews across mixed farming enterprises. We looked internationally at how they were solving GHG accounting. We also studied the tools. But when we spoke to producers, there were really 3 things that stood out. That data security, data privacy was really strong with producers. They also said, we're time poor, we're not going to enter data multiple times. You can meet my data currently where it is. And the third thing was, we're a mixed farming enterprise, so a single solution is not going to work for us. We need mixture, and so that's how we came up with the environmental accounting platform. We've standardised that and created a platform that holds the 15 calculators together. We've attracted 15 RDCs to that investment, and it's a platform that enables the market. We really, one of the reflections here is how we've used us as an independent not-for-profit to be pre-competitive. These things really support collaboration so strongly. But yeah, look, we've got really great traction with that particular platform, internationally being recognised as to how we've corralled and brought together so many commodities into one location to power all platforms in one location. I do think that we see more of this coming. Whether or not it's with Katie's work or Jojo's work about the exchanges or the AASF or natural capital biodiversity.
And thanks, Sam, and I will give a shout out to AIA and your leadership on that environmental accounting platform. It's a great example of a common challenge and a collective theme that you identified, and it also goes to other points that other panellists have reflected on of how do you collect once, use many times, and also, Sam, as you just said then, how do you spend that dollar once, particularly if you're a hardworking farm business, you want to be bothered as few times as possible so you can run your business. A question, Katie, I'm going to throw to you, and then Brenton, I'll draw you back in as well. We can be a bit inward focused in ag. It's hard enough to think across different parts of agriculture, different commodities or different sectors within the broader ag, but what about beyond ag? So what can we learn about data collection, management, governance and use from other sectors? Have you got any insights from the Australian Farm Institute?
Yeah, so there's not been enough work done there, I would say. There has been some work and there should be more. Not that we're touting for more work, someone out there can do the work. What we've learnt, not just through the AASF, but also through watching what's been happening with the data exchange, through what Sam and the team have put together with the EAP as well, is that we do tend to focus inward in agriculture and think, well, because we are innovative, and we really are, we're very innovative in Australian ag, and we're quite independent as well, then we tend to rest on our own decisions and look to our own past experience, rather than looking outside and saying, well, what do people outside ag do? How does the health sector, for example, manage data? Because the way the Australian agricultural system, and Brenton, I'm sure you can talk to this in much more detail from an ABS perspective, we do tend to be quite siloed in our approach, even when we set up systems and mechanisms to break the silos, then people just sort of form in line within the silos, within the system that we set up deliberately to break the silos. So particularly looking at a sector like health, let alone other service aspects of the economy, would be a really good way to kind of break that. But I just also wanted to pick up on a couple of the points that both Sam and Jojo made in terms of decisions, making really good decisions with data. Because when I talked before about trust, it's not just that you need data so you can prove to other people that you are trustworthy. It's also about building trust in your own decisions, being able to make evidence-based decisions within agricultural businesses. So that's another, proof point for getting the data right in the first place, so that not just we as an industry, but we as individuals can use that to make good decisions. And I think, Sam, you mentioned specifically precision to decision ag. Our people talk a lot about that report, which is when 15 RDCs did actually get together and co-fund that work as well. And the figure that came out of that, AFI did the economic analysis, and there was a figure that $24 billion was the potential if we adopted digital agriculture more effectively than we were. That was the gap that we were missing. If you think about those graphs from PC this morning about the innovation gap. But people then got quite focused on we need to adopt technology better in order to meet that gap. But it was about using the data to make better decisions. That's why it was called Precision to Decision Agriculture, that project. So learning from the health sector and others would be really important, but I'd also really like to hear from Brenton about some specific examples that ABS might have where you can say, well, we cracked this nut and we can apply those lessons somewhere else.
You've asked my question for me. That was exactly what I was going to ask you. What are those lessons from outside ag, from ABS perspective?
Yeah, I'd also put it more in an international context as well. So Australia is not unique in facing these challenges. Certainly in the agricultural sector, the usual like-minded countries like Canada, US, New Zealand, very, very similar situation. And indeed, from a National Statistical Organisation perspective, a lot of these countries are facing a lot more challenges than we currently do in terms of collecting survey responses. So just to give you one example, in the UK, they had to cease producing the monthly unemployment rate because their survey response rates fell to such low levels that they just couldn't produce reliable data. And you can imagine how big a deal that is, particularly at a post-COVID response when Bank of England is jacking up interest rates. It's far from ideal. So organisations across the world are looking to, well, how can we produce official statistics without relying on survey data? So somewhat comforting getting together with international colleagues to talk through shared challenges. And but you're right though, there's other sectors within Australia we can learn from as well. Even, you know, I drew an analogy between the way we estimate the cattle numbers to the way we estimate population numbers. So that was one of the early use of admin data in the ABS, just looking at birth registries, death registries, and net overseas migration. What I would though say is that agricultural modernisation program in the ABS has actually been at the forefront of a lot of these trends. So yes, we can learn from other sectors, but it's certainly the case that other sectors are learning from ag as well.
And it is heartening to see too that if you think beyond statistical collection per se, if you think about the traceability initiatives that the department, for example, and Adam, you can probably tell us more about this, the traceability initiatives that the department's funding, you know, there's been the development of an Australian Agricultural Traceability Protocol under that program of work, which is still a prototype, so not using it yet, but being investigated very carefully based on the United Nations Transparency Protocol. So again, learning from what has been done well somewhere else, applying it to an Australian agricultural context in order to do what Jojo and Sam have just said, tell us once and get it through the system quickly and cleanly rather than people having to input data at multiple stages through those systems.
Yeah, Jojo.
Yeah, so I want to add a new flavour to it. You mentioned sometimes we could be a bit too siloed, so we've called the Australian Agricultural Data Exchange, acronym AADX. Now we're deciding to actually drop the long name and use the short name because when we started using it more and more, we found out that people now see it just as an agricultural data exchange. It doesn't have any data. But for a data exchange to succeed, you need a lot of different data. So we have a project called the Futures of Seafood where we're experiencing what in our field called spatial squeeze. There are a lot of players in the marine space, offshore renewable, oil and gas, marine shipping. To have proper policy decisions, you need to bring together all these different data sets. And a lot of that are private data sets, whether they're offshore renewable or something that you need for a permit, for instance, fishing activity data, recreational fishing, weather data, so on and so forth. And to bring them all together, and that's what's going to give the insights for a government to be able to make better policy decisions to see who's impacted, who's not, etc. Right? So that's where we need to think more in terms of not just agricultural data, but data exchanges in general. That's going to liberate a lot more data from different areas and for different data exchanges to be able to talk together. Right? We're working with Australian Research Data Commons and their Trusted Environmental Data platform. Again, they're trying to use data from different mining companies, which are super confidential, add that with environmental data so that it could be policy making and also approvals that could be made for offshore renewables, so on and so forth. So we need to think more broadly about how can we control that tap, have the permission access to private data that's only been used for particular purposes.
Yeah, it's a great example because I know, having worked on and off in fisheries policy for a few years, 20 years ago we were seeing the first sort of new marine parks. There was no offshore renewable investment in Australia. There was a lot of offshore energy sources but not renewables, and now we've got a whole new suite of offshore wind farms, and they all add up to what you termed a spatial squeeze. So the data sources have got to go much further than just agriculture. What I'm going to do now is, I know there'll be questions out there coming through on the tech, so I think magically I'll be handed a laptop shortly. But before I do that, I'm going to see if there's a question from the floor. And look, the one has come because I want to mix it up as well. So we'll take a question from the floor. And if you could just say your name and then throw the question to a panellist, and then I'll go here as well.
Hello. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, there we go.
Thanks a lot, Adam. My name's Mark Stevenson. I'm an economist at the MDBA, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. I'd just like to touch on a few things that you talked about on your whole panel. So I think data gaps was one sort of area we mentioned, and that your new agricultural modernisation program, and you've produced some new stats, which is very welcome. But there's still a few gaps there. For example, irrigated agriculture in the Murray-Darling Basin, we stopped measuring water use back in 2021, and we don't have any statistics about water use. So can't work out what gross value of agriculture, irrigated agricultural production is, for example. And the new statistics are not at a regional enough scale, at a granular enough scale, at SA2 scale, so on, just at state level or whatever. And there's no real, it's even on the horizon until 2030, probably not at SA2 level for many commodities. And it's going to be hard to aggregate those sort of numbers into a region like the Murray-Darling Basin, for example. So I was just wondering, you talked about different sort of data sources like crop mapping, and then maybe using satellite data or other sort of industry sources. And is there any talk about multiple sources and to triangulate perhaps some of this data to be able to probably in the future provide some more granular data perhaps, or for some of and plug some of these gaps? Is there any thinking about how to triangulate some of these data sources together, or use innovative new ideas to be able to plug some of these gaps? Thanks very much.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So we've been pretty transparent, I like to think, about the achievements to date in the modernisation program, but alongside that also very transparent about the shortcomings. So you're exactly right to point out that there's gaps. It's sort of interesting from my perspective a little bit when you think about data quality. So in moving to this new system, a few gaps have emerged, but part of the necessity for change was the fact that we were getting declining survey response rates, and the quality of the former data wasn't quite where we wanted it to be. So while we might have been able to produce more statistics, we knew we had to come up with a new method in order to produce those stats that tick all those boxes that I mentioned before about being reliable, objective, and so on. We're working hard to fill those gaps. Touched on, I think, before about satellite data and also farm software data as being two potential sources that we can draw on, that it's quite promising, but that there's more work to do. But we'll continue to engage with users, and we appreciate feedback like that to try and help us focus our efforts.
This really does come back, though, doesn't it, to what phrase you used before, Adam, and I know Treasury uses this phrase a lot as well, is measuring what matters. And deciding what matters is really the first point, surely, and I think my panellists would agree, in any kind of data collection exercise. So any number of people in this room would have completely different use cases for the data sets that we're talking about here, and being able to decide as an organisation like the ABS where you prioritise your resources is always very tricky. It's one of the things, so the AASF, for example, it's not often talked about. It's usually talked about as a way of communicating externally what agriculture is trying to do for sustainability goals and principles. But it also helps that kind of framework, because it's not just about environment, it's about social sustainability and financial sustainability and profitability as well. Looking at what those principles are and then being able to say, well, as an industry, we need to know more about this and we don't have data for that. because that data's not all coming from agriculture. Some of it's coming from agricultural sustainability frameworks or from statistical sources or from private sources. Some of it's coming from the health system or from mental health initiatives. It's coming from all over the economy and all over society. So being able to prioritise what matters is absolutely vital when you're talking about those kinds of gaps in systems, because there's always going to be a gap, right? We're never going to know everything.
Yeah.
How's the exchange treating that, Jojo?
Oh, well, one of the things is just making it visible, right? So it's a data marketplace is what is one of the main features of the data exchange is a marketplace, right? The example I use is a platform to connect those with the data and those who need the data. Does not necessarily in the sense of being open where everyone can access to, right? There's also the talk about sometimes say that there's a cost associated with collecting the data and some want to be remunerated for it. And I ask the question, how much? We don't know until you test it in the market, right? So having a marketplace to say, all right, this is data has been collected, these are the data, here's the metadata, you can't get access to it, but now you know the data exists. So now, does this data then feed into the different aspects of your sustainability framework, or is it going to be used for something else? Or someone else might come and say, you know what, with these data, I can actually produce something that will add to your bottom line. And that's bringing to light the existence of these data sets. It's not just about knowing someone who knows someone who has the data and then trying to get the data. Take that aside. Sometimes I use the example of like, if we didn't have booking services like What If, Expedia, etc., you need to know which hotels exist. You need to call them up to see if it's available. What if we could just like make it transparent? Doesn't mean the hotels are free, but just knowing that allows that free flow of information, and that's why I keep using that liberation of the data.
Yeah, it's I'm going to come back to you in a sec, Jojo, to ask you of a practical example. One thing I know we've been doing in DAF to liberate data is compiling data on all of our free trade agreements, and it's a system called NextDoc. And rather than us saying, have a look at, the new FTA in, say, the UAE, it's just putting all of that online so that different businesses can work out where they want to focus their market efforts and they can access that data. It's a very niche data set. We're still working that through. But could you give me a practical example of where a data exchange has been implemented and in a particular sector or industry?
Right. See, Australia, we're still in the nascent stages of trying to get the data exchange up. Europe has done. They're a fair bit away ahead. Like you got Ben here. I think it's the second traction tool from which the idea for the data exchange came from in Netherlands. There's a thing called Join Data. But if you look at some of the different data exchanges that's been in place and been assessed, so I'm going to take two examples from the UK. One's called the Marine Data Exchange. They're using it especially for the offshore renewable energy area, so that all of that seashore mapping, all the different data sets been collected and made available through the exchange. And they did an assessment where it says that if the exchange didn't exist, they would have had to spend £1.5 billion recollecting the data because no one knew it existed or it's been used once. Another one in the agriculture area is called Agrimetrics. It was funded by Innovate UK, and they did an assessment where the dollar spent by Innovate UK had a pound spent by Innovate UK had a £37 of gross value addition added to the economy because the data exchange, for that sense, it's in the agricultural sense, has returned back to the economy. So those are the kinds of efficiency gains that we could be looking at by having a data exchange that's giving more transparency to the data and letting the data flow.
That's a great example. Brenton, I'm going to come to you because looking at the data in front of me of the most popular question, it's about the ABS. And you've made a point already that the more efficient your collection of data from different sources, perhaps the quicker to market. An historic frustration that's been expressed in the past from farmers is it might take 2 to 3 years before, or the ABS data always seems to be a few years behind. I mean, that's an old reflection. Can you reflect on how these new data collection processes address that lag? But also, are there some is there some aspect where there'll always be a time lag between the collection of the data and the use of it?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and those dimensions that I mentioned earlier, I think one that I failed to mention was timeliness. So we care a lot about timeliness. I think there's trade-offs all over the place is partly where I think about it. If you make data more timely, often it's of lower quality, often it means subsequent revisions. So these are trade-offs that we can make partly through discussions with users to understand what dimensions of quality they care most about. Potentially there's scope to improve timeliness through the new approach. I'm sort of being non-committal in part because of my experience with the census of population and housing. So we have 85% of households responded to the census online in 2021, so only 15% on paper. So you would think that would mean we could produce outputs more quickly than what we did previously, but it's not actually the case. There's still a lot of processing that needs to be done. Just that volume of 15% of paper forms is still a lot. But as I mentioned before, a lot of the admin data sources we use, the data isn't necessarily clean, so a lot of editing is required, a lot of follow-up is required. So yeah, so it's a long way of saying yes, there's potential, but don't want to be too committal.
Yeah, and it goes to one of Katie's reflections before, that data needs to build trust, and therefore the QA processes are very important. Now, there are a lot of other questions I would love to ask on your behalf, but we are hitting time. So what I'll do to wind up, and Sam, I'll start with you. Can I get each panellist to share one last reflection on the sense of opportunity that you see? What's one thing that you could leave us with where you see a big opportunity in the better use of data for shaping modern agriculture?
Yeah, well, I think just listening to this whole conversation, there's a lot to take out of it. And I think in your one-on-one chat before, you were talking about pulling the curtain back on sorts of things, and just that recent question about real time. I mean, I think that, how we have approached things in the environmental accounting platform is to enable the market. Rather than being seen as a competitor in the market, enable it. Stand back. We have no competitors because you can connect to this. And there are people that are designing things to do things in real time, agronomists in the field and all these sorts of things, that knowing that they're connected to a reliable, standardised, consistent platform sitting behind driving it, and that centralisation will take us forward in Australian agriculture. And I mentioned to you before, the way in which you do things, collaboration is a tool. What we need to focus on are things to shift the needle. What we've done is looked at environmental accounting and how we shift the needle with that. With that work that you were mentioning before, that Jojo said, there's a benefit, there's a real value. Well, we discovered that. We got a 17-to-1 benefit cost ratio from the EAP. It generated $83 million worth of value just in our one flagship project through collaboration as a tool. And it's proven to be 11 times more cost effective to maintain a platform than individual calculators, which is a cost saving of 54 million. So yeah, pull the curtain back, enable the market, using collaboration as a tool. There is huge value to be attracted to the types of things like the productivity gains that we've got to achieve that we were talking about this morning. So I think cleverly about those things will, hopefully we're back here next year thinking about, another layer in data and digital.
Sam, that's a great final thought from you, and particularly it goes to the DNA of AIA, using collaboration as a tool and spending that dollar once. And if you can getting a benefit cost ratio of up to 17-to-1, that's extraordinary. So that's a great example. Jojo, have you got any final reflections on shaping modern agriculture and some seeds for opportunities?
Well, I do, right? So we talk about Australian agriculture, export-oriented, etc. Let's think of it in the same term with data, right? In my experience, what I've found is that going out and asking, hey, I know you've got the data, would you like to share, etc., and just relying on their altruistic drivers doesn't really always work, right? So what I found is like the takeaway was that instead of saying it like that, if we flip the script and say, hey, what data would you like to have to make your business work better, or would you like to have to do more? And taking the marketplace and the trade example, if we can connect those, then it makes them want to actually do that transaction more rather than it just being giving, right? Instead of just a one-way street, open it up and say, all right, what data can I try to get you for you to be able to do X, Y, Z that you found missing? And that it's a more opening type of conversation than can I have that data?
Yeah, I think that's a great reflection. Katie?
Well, I think I have to just come back to that measuring what matters, that's what you need to ascertain the purpose of the data that you're trying to collect and see where it can provide value both to the people seeking the data and the people using the data at the other side. If we think about the kinds of programs of work that the AFI has been doing just in the past couple of years on sustainability, on land use tensions, on carbon opportunities, a lot of the problems that we face in Australian agriculture come back to a lack of understanding about what the real opportunity might be, but also what the real threats to the industry might be. And sometimes it is just a perception barrier, it's not a real barrier. So having the right data to make good decisions, evidence-based decisions for the industry, and helping to use that data to build trust outside the industry and break down some of those barriers is really important.
Yeah, fantastic. Data to build trust and make the right decisions. Brenton?
Yeah, so I'm certainly very positive. There's never been more data available than what there is today. I think there's probably great collaboration, possibly greater collaboration than what there has been in the past between government and industry and commercial providers. So it's a huge opportunity, including with technology, to help us actually make use of this large volume of data. Might just end on trust. That's probably the word that's come up most. I read a saying today. It's a Dutch saying, apparently, that trust arrives on foot and departs on horseback.
Yeah.
So that resonated with me when I read it, and so I just sort of leave that as my final words.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great, thinking about agriculture and trade, the Dutch were great traders in the 17th and 18th century, and to this very day. Trust arrives on foot. I like that one. So I think that's a fantastic point at which to conclude this discussion about data for shaping modern agriculture. Brenton Goldsworthy, Sam Brown, Katie McRobert, Jojo Soleil, thank you so much for sharing the range of insights based on your very extensive experience across Australian agriculture, with a bit of international flavour as well. So can I ask everyone to join me in thanking our wonderful panel?
Thanks, Adam. I'm sure everybody can agree that that conversation could have continued for much longer with the breadth and depth of insights and reflections. And like all good journalists, it was generating a lot of questions for me, as I'm sure it was a lot of people in the room. So just on some of those points that came up repeatedly, you certainly kept me on my toes and other people surrounding me. I would like to put some counter questions to the audience that you can take with you and have discussions over afternoon tea. If you're joining us online, please engage in the conversation using the hashtag ABARES Outlook. One of the things that came up was that if data is the fuel to innovation, the question would be, what will be the accepted cost of potentially powering AI with its enormous drain on water and energy? Also managing those hallucinations and the quality of that data. If there's a need to liberate data sets personally and professionally, what policy barriers exist, if any, to accessing that data? How we measure data matters. With the speed of change, how do we stay on top and current with what matters? The overwhelming question and thread to this conversation was on trust. And so that's a perfect segue to a session tomorrow, session 6, which will be talking about balancing that social license. It will be the centre of discussions. So join us in the hall now for more conversation and hopefully finding some answers to these questions. Thanks.
Thank you. That was great.